Hey guys, Jim Vinosky with Manufacturing Talks. Welcome back to the show. We got a good one for you today. We got a guy named Jason Hayes. He is from the Mackinac Center for Public Policy right here in Michigan, a free market think tank that talks about things that are vitally important in manufacturing. And Jason's been hitting on a number of different topics that we are going to get into with him today. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive
in. PYS Media, your digital media relations agency. Public relations, website design, digital marketing. You get found by the customers and talent who need your solutions. You get media placements in top publications, the best job candidates coming to your website, a digital presence that gets you found by the right people. Call 616-298-8798 to get started today.
Okay, welcome back to the show. I'm Jim Vinosky. I am your host, and as always, thanks to DYS Media, our sponsor. Go definitely look those guys up online. They can help you out with your PR needs. And I'm really happy to be joined today by a guy whose work I've admired for quite some time, Jason Hayes. He is the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy here in Michigan, a free market think tank and research center that we are very glad to have in our state. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here. I appreciate you coming on. I think you've been writing about some very important topics in my manufacturing world, and I definitely want to dive into some of those. But before we do that, why don't you tell us about yourself, your background, kind of how you got to doing what you're doing today?
Okay. Looking back early in my life, I was always involved in outdoor activities. My dad was a hunter, and that my dad was also an academic and one of the few conservative academics out there in the education area. So I grew up expecting two things. One, people would push back against your ideas if you stated them publicly, and two, that you did a lot of things outside. And so it was normal for me to go hunting, hiking, and all of that throughout most of my life. So I turned that into an education opportunity and studied a mix of wildlife management, forestry, environmental science, and that. And I did a few degrees in that while I was in school in Canada. And in between doing that, I worked as a backcountry ranger in British Columbia's provincial parks. So nice. We did a lot of flying around and hiking. It's the kind of job that when you're in your mid-20s, you get paid to go hiking and flying. It's like, I'm there. I'm going to go.
Pretty sweet.
So I finished that. I did my undergrad at the forestry faculty at UBC, University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And after that, I worked as a forester for about 4 years doing silviculture surveys. So basically figuring out what's on the ground before you log and saying, this is what we're going to bring it back to after we're finished logging. So I did that. And then after I finished that, I went and did a master's degree at University of Calgary in environmental science. And then I moved into the energy world and worked there for about 14 years, working in trade associations, kind of telling the story of why energy is valuable to people's lives, and specifically affordable, reliable energy, and how that plays a role in everything that we do. And so did that again for a while. That job moved me down to Arizona from Canada. And then after doing that, I moved over to where I am currently, which is at the Mackinac Center, doing a mix of energy and environmental policy. So looking at where do we get our energy, how do the utilities use energy to produce the electricity that we all use, what other sources of energy can we use? Like one of the big issues I talk about is the Line 5 pipeline and the use of pipelines. And then also I do other environmental stuff like forest forest management policy and that, discussing how public lands management works and private forest management, private conservation goes. So it's a pretty broad mix, but I trained learning a lot of different techniques and ideas kind of as a generalist, and try to put that to use in the real world.
Very cool. So a few points to mention there. One, I did point out to Jason before we got on, I wore my t-shirt today in his honor. My dad spent his whole career in forestry. So I didn't even know that about you before I looked up your background before the show. Like I said, I've admired your writing and your work with the Mackinac Center for quite some time. But yeah, then finding out this background in forestry, now you're like my main man. What I didn't mention too is I just finished a 4-year stint as scoutmaster for my 2 scouts. Both my sons are scouts. One's an Eagle, now moved on from scouting. Nice. He's past 18. The other just got Life Scout the other night, so he's well on his way to Eagle himself. So we spend a lot of time outside.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah. So sounds like we got a lot in common, but you're here because of some of what you already mentioned. And I've been covering energy quite a bit lately. To me, it's really something that should be getting a lot more attention from my side of the world in manufacturing. And I'm trying to push that. Had some really great guests on about that. And you've taken some broader views that I want to get into. I've focused a lot on electricity, and I know you've covered that, but you mentioned the Line 5 pipeline here in Michigan and Canada. And let's just get into that. So you've covered quite a bit. What are the main points that people ought to know about in your mind? What are we getting wrong, and what should people be doing about that?
Well, I often start presentations with the notion that energy is absolutely essential to human well-being. We need that. It's directly linked to our quality of life, to our economic strength or viability. And then what a lot of people kind of get confused or don't know about is that having access to abundant, affordable, reliable, and flexible sources of energy is also a key point of, or makes it possible for us to have really good environmental quality. So some people will go, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because clearly the energy industry just destroys the environment, right? That's what I often hear. Right. And the reality is, no, if you have access to that abundant, affordable, reliable energy, you will tend to be a much richer and much better off society. And those rich societies, very wealthy societies, have the freedom, the luxury to be able to choose or make long-term decisions. So if you think in terms of a developing society, somebody in the developing world does not have that luxury because they're worried tonight, will my kids have food? Will I be able to keep my kids from freezing, or that sort of thing? Mm-hmm. So you tend to make very short-term, rapid decisions that often have long-term environmental impacts. And so if you have access to natural gas, nuclear, even coal, and those sorts of things, then you will be able to look further out into the future and say, okay, well, we're going to invest in technologies like, if pick coal, for example, we're gonna invest in things like electrostatic precipitators, bag houses, filters to clean up flue gas and that sort of thing. Or if you want to invest in nuclear, you can look out 80 to 100 years and invest in a reactor that's going to produce emissions-free electricity over decades and decades and decades. Mm-hmm. So that access to that energy is really what does that. So that's where, again, the companies that you're talking to in the manufacturing sector, they understand this, because a lot of them run 24/7, 3 8-hour shifts, 2 12-hour shifts or something like that. And so I'll give you one example that I've read recently in, I'll call it an industrial journal. They're talking about basically the idea that that the manufacturing or heavy industrial sector should be using renewable energy to decarbonize. And so the next line in that study was saying, But because of the fact that you can't rely on renewable energy 24/7, that industry is going to have to learn to work around the dictates of the weather. So these companies that are accustomed to running 24/7, they're now saying, hang on, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to be able to produce your products when the weather allows, not when you need to, not when your customers are asking for it. So those are the kind of things that, to me, are extremely important when we're dealing with energy policy, because if you figure you've got a new shift came on and the wind stops blowing, okay, what do you do with 100 or 500 or 1,000 workers who are now just sitting twiddling their thumbs? What do you ask them to go home and hope that, maybe you can call them back, or do you just lose an 8-hour shift?
Right.
Those are the kind of questions that manufacturers especially should be asking elected officials.
Yeah. Well, and you hit on a point that I hammer all the time, and that is that we in the manufacturing world, many of us do run literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. And what I think we're missing kind of hit me as you were talking is that a lot of people don't understand it's not greed that's causing us to run that way. You talked about the multi-decade investments in energy infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You have the same thing in the manufacturing world. We have multi-decade investments in very expensive technology and infrastructure. And if we're not running and producing constantly, we're not making the return on that investment. So what the people you're talking about who are saying, oh, you're just going to have to adjust, or telling us is you're going out of business.
Exactly. And
which is not really going to work for us.
Right. And so, look at it, especially in light of what's happening today with the UAW strikes.
Yeah.
How do you pay your employees call it a living wage, whatever term you want to use? How do you pay employees well enough to keep them interested in staying at your business if they just have to sit around and wait for the wind to blow? Right. You can't schedule that. These forms of electricity are not what's called dispatchable. You cannot trust them to be there. And when you actually have industry journals telling you, you're going to have to learn to work around the weather. Well, we've regressed back to the time where, our grandparents or our great-grandparents, sat in a hut somewhere and prayed, to whatever spirit they worshiped. Lord, please send us the right amount of rain so that the crops will grow. But then, Lord, please help it to stop raining when it's time for the crops to come in so that they dry out and we can, go out and harvest. And then, we pray that it's not too hard of a winter because we only got in this many cords of wood. We're back to the same sort of thing. Lord, please send the wind so that we can run our manufacturing facilities to produce the products that people need and not just want. Like you said, sometimes it's kind of painted as a greed thing. Mm-hmm. No, the capitalist system only works by supplying the needs and the desires of their customers. It's not you don't get rich by just selling whatever you want. You get rich by meeting the needs of your customers. And so if you're waiting for the wind to blow, you're not meeting the needs of your customers.
You mentioned something else too around air quality that we have made improvements over the years, and I think that's another piece that people both miss because they may not have that history. You get a lot of young people who are paying attention to environmental policy nowadays who don't know what things were like when we were burning coal and the cities were filthy, or burning wood and they were filthier. Another piece that I've seen people kind of conflate is CO2 with air quality that causes respiratory problems. And as you were talking again, I was thinking, the people who are suffering most with respiratory problems these days are the people who are cooking indoors with dirty fuel, right? Bjorn Lomborg talks about that all the time, how cooking fires cause so many deaths in developing countries. And so bringing people along with the fuels we have today will lead to a cleaner environment and will lead to millions of fewer deaths. And people don't realize that.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the most, like, if you think back to the old days where there was ideas about these imperialistic attitudes toward developing nations, there is nothing more imperialistic than telling people, no, you can continue to live in a developing state because we are not going to bother to lend you the money to build a natural gas turbine or a coal plant or something like that. We will not allow you to have that. Like I was speaking to a group just last night about this, and they were asking the same thing about what is it that Germany is doing. Well, Germany, when it was going through its Energiewende program, was closing down crazily. It was closing down its nuclear plants and switching from coal to Russian natural gas and building wind and solar. And so when Russian natural gas proved to be a bit of a problem for them, they went right back and fired up their lignite powered plants. And for those that don't know, lignite is like bottom of the barrel when it comes to coal quality. So it's lignite and then subbituminous, bituminous, and then anthracite. So when I talk to people in the energy industry about burning lignite, the Texans, where they burned a lot of lignite, they called it burning dirt. So you're burning really the low rank coals with that. But the Germans were fine to go back and turn on their lignite plants. And so that provoked a response from the president of Kenya, who was interested to see the Germans who had told his country, you can't build coal because it'll damage the natural environment. It's a climate problem. He wrote an article, and I think it was in the BBC or it was in some European news source. And he basically said, you told us we can't burn coal, but yet when Russian natural gas doesn't work for you, you burn coal. What's wrong with this picture? There's a contradiction here. I thought coal was a problem for the climate. So why are you okay? Germany, the greenest of green countries, why are you okay with doing this? And so, yeah, there's a lot of that. If you allow people the freedom to build that sort of thing, it's something that Robert Bryce always talks about, his iron law of energy, that those people will choose the most reliable, cheapest forms of energy that they can get their hands on, because they want, not surprisingly, they want the same comforts that we have. They want to know that when they come into their home and they flick a switch, the lights will come on, or they turn a dial, their heaters will come on. They don't want their families dying of, inhaling the toxins that come from indoor cooking fires. They want access to a natural gas stove or an electric stove, just like the rest of us. So it should be obvious, but yeah, there's a lot of confusion about these issues.
Absolutely. And speaking of confusion, you've written quite a bit about the situation here in Michigan. So let's talk about that a little bit, and some of the kind of, you mentioned regression, and I think we've got some of that going on here in our home state now. Talk a little bit about the Michigan situation, if you would.
Yeah, all of the utilities are involved in, I'll say, they're implementing plans to meet net zero goals. They want to get their CO2 emissions down to net zero. And so their plans effectively all require the closure of big, reliable fossil fueled plants, typically coal. So DTE has gotten approved settlement agreement in their most recent integrated resource plan. And for those that don't know what an IRP is, it's like a 20-year long visioning plan that says, here's how the utility is going to provide electricity to its customers over the next 2 decades. And so DTE's plan involves closing down the Monroe power plant, which is a big several gigawatt coal plant. They're going to close it as much, depending on, there's 4 boilers there. They're going to close 12 years ahead of schedule. And then 2 more, I think it's 8 years ahead of schedule. So Consumers Energy has the same plan. Theirs is even faster. Their big plant, the Campbell plant, which is out near Holland on the western side of the state, they're going to close that plant 15 years ahead of schedule. And the problem with that is shutting down reliable forms of energy that have kept us through how many winters? I think to January 2019 in Michigan, when all of us got a text message on our cell phone that said, please turn down your thermostats to 65 degrees or lower. It's something that the utilities call demand response, but they sent out that text message because it was extremely cold and there was a lot of demand for natural gas at that time because there was a fire and an explosion in one of their processing facilities. And so during that time, when it was -20 and the winds were blowing and there was clouds, so the solar was producing nothing, essentially, wind was below 4% of our total energy supply in the region. And the remaining natural gas plants, coal and nuclear, were producing essentially the rest. So those are the plants that the utilities are planning to close down in Michigan. They've already closed the Palisades nuclear plant in May last year. And interestingly, that one plant produced more clean, emissions-free electricity than all of Michigan's wind and solar put together.
Yep.
And so our plan is to shut down the things that work and then build. Right now, they're targeting, the two utilities are targeting 15.4 gigawatts of solar. For to put that in common terms, that's a lot. So we're going to build a lot of solar in a state that's not well known for its sunshine. Literally, Michigan is the fourth lowest incoming solar irradiance levels in the lower 48. So if you're going to build solar, it makes sense. I mean, I can make arguments against building solar, but if you have to build it in the southwestern states like California, right, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. So that's what we're planning to do. Shut down the stuff that works and build the stuff that doesn't work. And that's being supported right now by the governor's My Healthy Climate Plan. It's a long-term plan that she's put out. And then there's also several different bills that are being discussed in the Michigan legislature right now that will mandate we close all of our coal plants by 2030, which is like 7 years away.
Yeah.
And
I was asked to comment on those bills, and my comment was Michigan manufacturers need to be making plans to leave the state.
Unfortunately, that's true. At the time when Governor Whitmer says she wants to make the state, a home, a welcome place for business to come in.
Right.
Well, our residential electricity rates, because of the way we power our state, right now, our residential, like for home, rates are 37% higher than Ohio.
Yep.
Like 31% higher than Illinois. This is not a way to attract business to the state, is by having unreliable, expensive electricity.
Right.
So you don't want that sort of thing when you're like, I'm a free market guy. I want low rates, low electricity rates, reliable electricity, so that we know that, please come to our state and build more stuff. Because when you do that, you make jobs that the average Michigan resident can have, and you're more likely to attract people to come to the state and stay if they know that they can find work.
Yep. So it's late breaking news. Have you had a chance to look into, digest it, all this idea that they would restart Palisades?
It is very new, and I'm glad that the folks at Wolverine have signed that power purchase agreement, because they're saying, I haven't seen their numbers, but they're saying that it pencils out. They can make it work in terms of costs, but that one, it should have never been closed in the first place. They should have kept it open. It still had close to a decade on its operating license, which could have easily been extended even beyond that. They're now looking at extending operating licenses on nuclear plants out to 100 years. Yep. So that one's only been operating around 50, 55 years, something like that. I think it went critical in 1971, if I remember correctly. So it shouldn't ever have been closed down. But now that they have, it's going to impose a lot of costs because they're going to have to bring it back up to code, so to speak, so that, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is okay with it operating. But they're going to have to spend a bunch of money to bring it back up and running. But like I've said before, the utilities are already planning to spend tens of billions of dollars building solar and wind, and the federal government is just flooding this area with printed money. They're just like magicking this money out of thin air. So ignoring the inflation problems and all that sort of thing that causes.
Yep.
If you have to spend money on stuff like this, if you have to subsidize something, I always say, if it's going to give elected officials a rash to not spend money on something like this, at least spend money on the stuff that works.
Yeah, exactly.
We know that Palisade works. It has worked for decades. And like I said, in 2021, that one plant, 811 megawatt nuclear plant, produced more clean, reliable electricity than all of the state's wind and solar put togetger. We know the Palisade
and consistently
plant works. Yeah, that's the thing. Like nuclear plants have a 95, 97% uptime. Their capacity factor is almost 100%.
Yeah.
So you shut nuclear plants down once every like 18 months to 2 years. You take the old fuel out, you put in new fuel, turn it on and let it go. And it runs for 18 months. So it just makes sense to run one of those, especially for the people that say they're worried about climate change, because they produce no emissions. So we should be doing more of that.
Well, and I certainly don't want to see our manufacturers leave Michigan, but I'm trying to shake Michiganders out of our complacency and our voting patterns of bringing in people who are doing really, really dumb things. So hopefully we can help people change their minds on that one, Jason. I'm going to shift gears on you. I just saw this piece the other day and it really piqued my interest that you wrote about recycling. So tell us a little bit about your take on that.
Generally, recycling is one of those things that most of us, I mean, if you're like 60 years or younger, you've probably had recycling, the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, drilled into your head from the time you were in kindergarten or something like that. So most of us just accept it on face value that this is what you do. You have to recycle. You put out your blue or your green box, or you wheel your green garbage bin out every few weeks to month, and that's what you do. But the reality is that a lot of the time, the recycling that we're putting out on the curb is being collected and then taken to the same landfill as the garbage that we put out in the bin beside our recycling bin, which is unfortunate because we're spending a lot of money doing this. Like, we're separate collection systems, different trucks, the blue and the green boxes. We've invested all this time and money and effort, like the effort of the average person to be, stripping their garbage apart and, we'll throw this away, but we'll recycle this. A lot of the times, especially after, it was about 4 or 5 years ago, China stopped purchasing a lot of our recycled materials. And as a result, the markets for it just vanished, evaporated. And so when it doesn't pay to recycle, again, a lot of the time that recycling just goes to the landfill.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really going back to that whole marketplace, right? There's not a market for these materials. And so making us do a bunch of extra work for nothing.
Yeah. People think that like glass is probably the best example of it, because glass is very expensive to recycle because it weighs a lot and that sort of thing. But it's dirt cheap to make because it's made out of silica. It's made out of sand. So it's relatively inexpensive. And once you start adding up the different costs, like, okay, we're going to buy the separate trucks, we're going to set out the collection bins and all that sort of stuff. Once you start adding it up and look, we also have to drive the trucks, which takes diesel fuel. We're actually doing more damage to the natural environment by recycling glass and some other things than we would by just throwing it out and making new. So it's actually more environmentally harmful to recycle glass in a lot of cases than it is to just toss it and make new stuff.
I found it interesting in your article. You talked about how just a little contamination could render a whole batch of recycling unusable. And then got me thinking, we never talk about the costs of that, of cleaning things out, all the water I waste rinsing my cans and bottles out. That's a cost for this recycling that in the end often isn't happening.
Right. To say nothing of your time, like if your time is worth anything and you stand there for whatever, a couple hours a week, rinsing out cans and doing all that sort of stuff. Yeah. But definitely you're using hot water or water that's been run through the municipal or the county water purification system. So you're using energy there. You're, all of the infrastructure, the water pipes, all that kind of stuff, all are being used to do this. So the environmental groups, the green groups are really big on saying, well, what's the life cycle impacts of this? If you start doing life cycle impacts of a lot of recycling, it really does not pencil up.
Yeah, interesting. Well, definitely want to go back to your time as a forester. You've written quite a bit about some of the misperceptions around recent wildfires, some of the causes, some of the effects. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, the most recent wildfires I found extremely interesting because that sort of like the air quality issues that people in New York and Washington, D.C. experienced, that sort of thing is pretty normal for people in Western states. Yeah. So I found that again, that schism that often exists between the West and the East interesting because that's just summer or fire season for most of the Western states, but it becomes a real problem. Somebody has to do something when somebody in New York has to breathe the same air as people in Utah or Wyoming, or like it's a very different kind of mindset. These problems that are, as long as they're a problem for a Western state or a Southern state or a Southwestern state, well, then it's not really a problem. But when it becomes an East Coast thing, then it's a problem. Somebody has to do something about it. But the thing that we keep telling people, like there's several of us in this area that work in forest management or write about forest management. To the folks at PERC, as a good example, there's another fellow, Todd Myers at Washington Policy Center, who does excellent work in this. And we're constantly reiterating the best way to deal with this sort of thing, even for those people that are convinced that climate change is the biggest thing that's causing these wildfires. The best thing to do with it is go in and manage your forests. Go in and clear the heavy brush, the built up brush that has grown naturally over decades as we have taken more and more of a hands-off approach, especially on public lands. There's this notion that public lands, the national forests and that sort of thing, should be managed almost to what is often termed kind of a pristine state of wilderness, untrammeled by humans. This notion that if nobody touches the forests and we can build sort of a figurative fence around them and don't do anything in them except fight fires, then what happens is the forests continue to grow. And so you have more grass, more small shrubs, more small, oftentimes low quality trees, because they're coming up underneath a large overstory of mature trees that shade out the smaller ones. And so you get this ladder effect of the smaller fuels and, a little bit higher fuels, and they're actually called ladder fuels. And when these plants grow, especially in years, this is what happened in Canada this year, you have a wet spring or a wet fall the year before, and you get a lot of growth of grasses and that sort of thing. And then you have a dry fire season. somebody starts a fire, whether it's like in Nova Scotia, they actually were charging several people with arson
Right.
going out. The same thing apparently happened in Hawaii in the Greek fires.
Yep.
For some reason, people have it in their minds this year to go out and start fires, but it can also be started just by accident. Somebody's camping and they forget, or they don't put their campfire out all the way. Somebody flicks a cigarette butt out of the window. Somebody's towing a trailer and they don't tighten up their tow chains and they're dragging on the pavement, sending sparks around. Those kind of fires, human-caused fires or lightning strikes from natural fires, get started, and in that dense, dry ladder fuel, you can get raging wildfires come up very quickly. And so the prescription that we always post and write about is the best way to avoid that, or to minimize the effects of fire, is to go through and clear that out. You do spacing and thinning or actual harvesting, like cut the trees and use them to do things like build desks. And again, your manufacturing people will understand this.
Yep.
You need wood to build a lot of these products that we sell, wood to make paper, wood to make cardboard boxes, all of those sorts of things. You can use forest products to do that. And so if you go in and you manage the forest properly, and then also bring in, once you've reduced the ladder fuels and the real heavy, high fire risk, bring fire back in and use it to manage. It's something called prescribed fires.
Yep.
You wait for the right time, when typically it's, early in the spring when everything is still green. Really good time is right after a small snow. So there's snow on the ground. You can go through and do a light burn, a prescribed burn, when you know what's going to happen, and you get rid of the grass and that sort of thing. And oftentimes what you end up with is what people typically think of as that park-like atmosphere, where you can walk through tall trees and it's kind of open underneath. And that's often what people think of as, the park kind of idea.
Yep.
Managing your forests allows you to have that. The best part of that is when you manage your forests like that, and a fire does start during fire season when it's dry and that, you don't have the ladder fuels to send these massive fires up into the crowns of trees. And so the fire burns out relatively quickly, or it burns along the ground and gets rid of a little bit more fuel, but it doesn't make this massive conflagration that you see on TV all the time. So managing your forests helps reduce wildfire.
Yeah. Like I mentioned, my dad was a forester, and we lived here in Michigan, but most of the summers I was growing up, would travel at some point during the summer out west and help fight the fires that were always happening out there. And I commented when the environmentalists were making their claims earlier this summer about how the Canadian wildfires were the result of climate crisis, that my dad would have been very surprised to learn that the fires he had fought all those years ago were caused by a climate crisis, because he was complaining about the improper forest management 40 years ago.
Yeah, if you look at the stats, like the one article that I wrote earlier this year, it's not the climate, it's the fuels. Right. If you look at the stats, the Canadian and American stats, the biggest fires were back in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s. Massive fires that, millions of acres were burned every year. And a lot of those stats, interestingly, have been removed from the federal databases. You have to go back and look into historical documents to find them. Yep. But when you have those kind of statistics that show massive big fires, then the trend lines slope down toward today. And so if you cut the timeline off at like 1980 or something like that, then the trend lines look like they're alarmingly going up. And so it's lies, darn lies, and statistics. You can fiddle with things and definitely make it look worse than it actually is.
Too true. Well, we are almost out of time, Jason. I'm curious what you have kind of coming out of your pen here in the near future and the longer term. What's going on with you and with the Mackinac Center?
With the Mackinac Center right now, if you look we're one of our guys is embroiled in the whole UAW strikes. He's dealing with that. Steve DeLee actually was on CNN yesterday. So kudos to Steve. He's doing good work there. From my pen, what I'm working on right now is a report that looks at the costs of the net zero legislation and the My Healthy Climate Plan that the governor has put out. So I'm madly scrambling to get that paper finished so that we can get it published while they're doing all the discussion about these energy bills. So that's what's coming up next. You can always watch for us on the Mackinac Center website. Our blog is pretty regularly updated. So for folks, that's Mackinac with a C. So it's MACKINAC.org. And our blog pops up right on the front page. But we stay busy doing that. Lots more radio, podcast, TV interviews. If people ask us to come on and try to explain things like the value of affordable, reliable energy and why managing your forests is a good idea. Keep talking about those sorts of things. That's what we're looking forward to.
Good. Well, and I will put a link to the Mackinac Center site on both the YouTube description and the podcast description for this show. Folks, definitely go and check out both Jason's work, which is phenomenal, and all his peers. They're doing great work there at the Mackinac Center. And like I said, we're very proud to have you guys in our state.
Yeah, well, we're happy to be here. It's a nice place to live. I enjoy it.
And I really appreciate you coming on the show. This was very informative, and we'll definitely have to have you back down the road.
Sounds good. Love to do it.
Okay. And of course, as always, thanks to you in our audience for tuning in. Like I said, this was incredibly informative. I can't promise that every show is going to be as informative as what Jason brought us today, but they're all going to be informative to some degree. So tune in again. We're here every Tuesday. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday, and don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.